This is insane HOA madness. She brought a ruler and a grudge. I am standing on my front porch with a small cardboard box of gate hardware at my feet when a middle-aged woman in a black windbreaker and blue sun hat marches across my lawn and starts screaming that I am in violation of the visible clutter ordinance. The box has been there for maybe 20 minutes. She is holding a phone up like she is filming me, and there is a tiny body camera clipped to her jacket. She says I have 48 hours to remove it, or the Eagle Ridge Association will fine me $250 and escalate to a lien. I am a FedEx-style route driver in Chicago, Illinois, and I moved here 6 months ago because the rent was cheaper than the city and the job pays just enough to cover bills. I cannot afford fines. I cannot afford tow fees. I cannot afford to lose this job because the HOA decides to block my truck or tow my car while I am on shift. The woman's name is Janice Smith, and she is the self-appointed compliance officer for the association. She says I am the reason this neighborhood stays civilized, and she turns on her heel and walks away before I can even respond. I pick up the box and carry it inside. I look out the window and see her standing at the curb typing on her phone. 10 minutes later, I get an email from the HOA management company with a violation notice. It says the gate hardware box was visible from the street for an extended period and constitutes clutter under the new visible storage rule. The email says I have 48 hours to comply, or the fine will be applied automatically. The email also says the compliance officer has the authority to issue stop work orders if I attempt to install the gate without prior approval. I did not even know there was a visible storage rule. I checked the HOA website and find a PDF of the bylaws. The visible storage rule was added 3 weeks ago in a special meeting I never heard about. The minutes say the vote was unanimous. There is no mention of who attended or who voted. I email the management company and ask for the attendance log. They do not reply. I go outside and start unloading the rest of my fence supplies from my truck. I have 6 fence panels, 2 bags of concrete, a post hole digger, and a wheelbarrow. I stack the panels on the side of the house and leave the wheelbarrow near the back corner. The tire sinks slightly into the grass because the ground is wet from the drizzle. I am halfway through moving the concrete when Janice appears again. She has a clipboard this time. She says the wheelbarrow is a violation because it is visible from the neighbor's yard and it is creating a ground disturbance. I tell her the wheelbarrow is temporary and I am using it to haul materials. She says the rules do not care about temporary. She says the HOA has a zero-tolerance policy for unapproved property modifications. She takes a photo of the wheelbarrow and writes something on her clipboard. Then she walks to the back corner of my yard and kneels next to the property line. She pulls out a tape measure and measures the distance from my fence post to the edge of the grass. She writes down the number and takes another photo. She says my fence setback is incorrect and I need to submit a survey before I can proceed. I tell her I already have a survey. She says it does not count unless the HOA reviews it. She says I need to stop all work immediately or the HOA will send a vendor to remove the materials and charge me for it. She says this is about safety. Then she turns and walks away again. I call the management company. I get voicemail. I leave a message asking for clarification on the setback rule and the survey requirement. I do not hear back. I call again the next morning. This time someone picks up. She says the compliance officer has the authority to interpret the rules and issue stop work orders. She says if I disagree, I can request a hearing, but the hearing will not happen for at least 2 weeks, and the stop work order stays in effect until then. She says if I proceed without approval, the HOA will treat it as a willful violation and the fines will double. I ask about the visible storage rule and the vote. She says the vote was legitimate and the minutes are on file. She says if I have questions about the minutes, I need to submit a public records request. I hang up and send the request by email. I ask for the attendance log, the voting record, and any prior complaints filed by Janice Smith. I do not expect a reply for days. I go outside to move the wheelbarrow. There's a bright orange cone sitting next to it. The cone has a printed tag zip-tied to it. The tag says the wheelbarrow is in violation of the ground disturbance ordinance and must be removed within 24 hours. The tag is unsigned. I move the wheelbarrow to the driveway. I move the concrete bags to the garage. I take photos of everything. I am not giving Janice any more ammunition. But the fence panels are still stacked against the house, and I know she is going to come for those next. I text my neighbor across the street. His name is Ed. He is a retired police officer, and he has lived here for 12 years. I ask him if he knows anything about the visible storage rule or the setback enforcement. He texts back, Janice has been doing this for months. She got herself appointed compliance officer, and now she walks the neighborhood with a clipboard and a camera. She has filed complaints against 6 people this year. 3 of them paid the fines just to make it stop. I text back, did anyone fight it? He replies, one guy tried. Janice showed up to the hearing with a binder full of photos, and the board sided with her. The guy ended up moving. I stare at the text. I cannot move. I cannot afford to move. I have a lease and a job, and I need the fence to keep my tools secure, because the last place I lived, someone broke into my truck twice. That night, I hear a noise outside. I look out the window and see a golf cart with a blinking amber light crawling slowly past my house. Janice is driving. She stops in front of my driveway and takes a photo of the fence panels. Then she drives away. I write down the time and take a photo of the golf cart from the window. The amber light is still blinking. I do not sleep well. The next morning, I get another email. This one is from the HOA attorney. It says the association has received multiple complaints regarding unapproved fence construction and visible material storage at my address. It says the HOA is authorized to hire a vendor to remove the materials if I do not comply within 24 hours. It says the cost of removal will be added to my account and treated as a special assessment. If I do not pay within 30 days, the HOA will file a lien. I read the email 3 times. I forward it to Ed. He calls me 5 minutes later. He says, this is escalating fast. You need to get in front of the board. I tell him I requested a hearing, but they said it would take 2 weeks. He says, you do not have 2 weeks. Janice is going to force their hand. You need to show up at the next board meeting and demand to be heard. I ask when the next meeting is. He says, tonight. 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. I thank him and hang up. I call my dispatcher and tell him I need to leave my route early. He is not happy, but he says he will cover it. I cannot afford to get fired, but I also cannot afford a lien. I spend the afternoon gathering documents. I print the original survey. I print the violation notices. I print the email from the attorney. I print the bylaws and highlight the sections on hearings and appeals. I also print the visible storage rule. The rule says visible storage includes any materials or equipment that can be seen from the street or adjacent properties. It does not define temporary. It does not define clutter. I write down every word, because later I plan to read them back to her. I put everything in a folder. I also print the email I sent to the management company requesting the public records. I have not received a response yet, but I want them to know I asked. At 6:30, I drive to the clubhouse. The parking lot is almost empty. There are 3 cars and the golf cart with the blinking amber light. Janice is standing near the entrance, talking to 2 other people. One of them is holding a binder. I park at the far end of the lot and walk toward the door. Janice sees me and says something to the other 2. They all turn and look at me. I keep walking. I go inside and find the meeting room. There is a folding table at the front with 5 chairs. 4 people are sitting there. One of them is the HOA president. I recognize him from the website. His name is Mark. He is in his 50s, wearing a polo shirt and khakis. He looks annoyed. The other 3 are board members. I do not know their names. There are about 10 people sitting in the audience. Ed is one of them. He nods at me. I sit next to him. Mark starts the meeting. He goes through the agenda. There is a discussion about landscaping contracts. There is a discussion about pool maintenance. There is a discussion about updating the front gate key fobs. Then he says, we have one enforcement matter to address. He looks at Janice. She stands up and walks to the front. She opens her binder and starts reading. She says, I have been in violation of the visible storage ordinance for 3 days. She says I have refused to comply despite multiple notices. She says I am also in violation of the setback ordinance, and I have not submitted a survey for review. She says the fence materials I have stacked against my house are a safety hazard and an eyesore. She says the HOA has a duty to protect property values and enforce the rules. She says she is requesting authorization to hire a vendor to remove the materials immediately. She closes the binder and looks at Mark. He says, "Do you have any documentation?" She hands him the binder. He flips through it. He does not look at me. He says the board will take this under advisement and vote at the end of the meeting. Janice sits down. I raise my hand. Mark ignores me. I stand up. I say I have documents that need to be reviewed before any vote. Mark looks annoyed. He says this is not a hearing. If you want a hearing, you need to submit a request in writing. I say, I did. 2 days ago. He looks at the other board members. One of them shrugs. He says we did not receive it. I pull out my phone and show him the email. He says that does not count. You need to send it to the board, not the management company. I say the management company is supposed to forward it. He says, well, they did not. He looks back at Janice. He says, we will proceed with the vote. Ed stands up. He says, hold on. You cannot vote on enforcement without giving him a chance to respond. That is a violation of open meeting rules. Mark looks irritated. He says, this is not a public hearing. This is a board meeting. Ed says, it is still subject to open meeting requirements. If you are voting on enforcement, he has a right to be heard. Mark sighs. He says, fine, you have 2 minutes. I walk to the front. I open the folder. I pull out the survey. I say, the setback is correct. Here is the survey. It was done 6 months ago when I bought the house. Janice says, that survey is not valid. You need a new survey that shows the current property line. I say the property line has not moved. Janice says the HOA requires a survey that is less than 30 days old for any fence work. I say, where is that rule written? She does not answer. I pull out the bylaws. I say the bylaws do not mention a 30-day requirement. Janice says it is in the compliance manual. I say I have never seen a compliance manual. Mark says the compliance manual is for board use only. I say, then how am I supposed to know the rules? Mark says, you are supposed to ask before you start work. I say, I did. I submitted the survey and I ordered materials. No one told me I needed additional approval. Janice says, you did not submit the survey to the HOA. You submitted it to the county. I say, the county survey is the official survey. Janice says the HOA has its own standards. I turn to Mark. I say, is there a written standard for surveys? He does not answer. I say, if there is no written standard, how can you enforce it? He says the compliance officer has discretion to interpret the rules. I say, that is not what the bylaws say. I open the bylaws and start reading the section on enforcement. It says the board must provide written notice of a violation and give the homeowner 10 days to respond before imposing a fine. I say, I received notice 2 days ago. You cannot impose a fine yet. Mark says we are not imposing a fine. We are authorizing removal of materials. I say that is worse than a fine. You are threatening to seize my property. He says we are not seizing it. We are removing it. I say without a hearing, without due process. Ed says he is right. You cannot do that. Mark looks at Janice. She says, go ahead and call whoever you want. I have a committee for that. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more wild HOA drama. I pull out the email from the attorney. I say I also received an email threatening a lien if I do not pay for the removal. Mark says, that is standard procedure. I say, you have not even voted yet. How can you threaten a lien before the board takes action? He does not answer. I say I also requested public records 2 days ago, and I have not received a response. I requested the attendance log for the meeting where the visible storage rule was passed. I requested the voting record. I requested any prior complaints filed by Janice Smith. Mark says we do not have to provide that. I say, yes, you do. This is Illinois. HOA records are subject to public disclosure under state law. Ed says he is right. You have 10 days to respond to a records request. Mark looks flustered. He says, we will provide the records when we are ready. I say I need them before you vote. If the visible storage rule was not passed properly, the enforcement is invalid. Janice stands up. She says, the rule was passed properly. I was there. I say, then the attendance log will show that. She does not respond. I turn back to Mark. I say, I am not trying to cause trouble. I just want to build a fence. I have the survey. I have the materials. I am following the rules. If there are additional requirements, I need them in writing. Mark says, the compliance officer will provide you with the requirements. I say, she already did. She told me to stop work and submit a new survey. I am asking for the board to review the existing survey and confirm whether it meets the standards. If it does not, I need to know what the standards are. Mark looks at the other board members. They all look uncomfortable. He says, we will take this under advisement and respond in writing. I say, when? He says, within 10 days. I say, the email from the attorney said I have 24 hours or you will hire a vendor. He says, we will put the vendor on hold until we review your documents. I say, I need that in writing. He says, you will get it in writing. I sit down. Janice glares at me. The meeting continues. They vote on the landscaping contract. They vote on the pool maintenance. They do not vote on my enforcement matter. Mark says the board will reconvene in a special session next week to address it. The meeting ends. I walk out. Ed follows me. He says, you did good. You bought yourself some time. I say, I need more than time. I need to know what they are hiding. He says, they are hiding the fact that the visible storage rule was never properly passed. I ask how he knows. He says, I was at that meeting. There were only 3 board members there. They did not have a quorum. They voted anyway. I say, can you testify to that? He says, I can do better. I recorded it. I stare at him. I say, you recorded the meeting. He says, I record every meeting. I have been doing it for years. Janice does not know. I say, can I have a copy? He says, I will send it to you tonight. I go home. I check my email. There is a message from the management company. It says they are processing my public records request and will respond within 10 business days. There is no mention of the attendance log or the voting record. I forward the email to Ed. I also forward him the email from the attorney. He replies, they are stalling. They know the vote was invalid. I write back, what do I do? He replies, you show up to the special session and you play the recording. I write back, will they let me? He replies, they cannot stop you. It is a public meeting. If they try to shut you down, you walk out and file a complaint with the state. I write back, thank you. He replies, do not thank me yet. Janice is not going to let this go. Watch your back. The next morning, I wake up to the sound of a truck. I look out the window and see a contractor truck parked in my driveway. There are 2 men standing near my fence panels. Janice is with them. She is pointing at the panels and talking. I run outside. I say, what is going on? One of the men says, we are here to remove the materials. I say, on whose authority? He says, the HOA. I say, the board has not voted yet. He says, we have a work order. I say, I need to see it. He pulls out a clipboard and shows me a sheet of paper. It has the HOA letterhead and a signature. The signature is illegible. I say, who signed this? He says, the compliance officer. I look at Janice. She says, I have the authority to issue work orders in emergency situations. I say, this is not an emergency. She says, you have been in violation for 4 days. The board authorized me to take immediate action. I say, the board said they would put the vendor on hold. She says, they changed their minds. I pull out my phone and call Mark. He does not answer. I call the management company. I get voicemail. I turn to the contractor. I say, if you touch my property, I will call the police. He says, we are just doing our job. I say, your job is to follow lawful orders. This is not a lawful order. Janice says, you are interfering with HOA business. I say, you are trespassing. She says, I am on HOA property. I say, this is my driveway. She says, the driveway easement belongs to the HOA. I say, show me the easement. She does not respond. I dial 911. Janice steps back. She says, you are making a big mistake. I say, so are you. The police arrive 15 minutes later. There are 2 officers. I explain the situation. I show them the email from Mark saying the vendor would be put on hold. I show them the work order signed by Janice. One of the officers asks Janice if she has authorization from the board. She says she does. He asks for documentation. She says the documentation is in the clubhouse. He says, then we need to see it before we can allow the removal. She says, I do not have to show you anything. This is a civil matter. He says, if you are authorizing work on private property, I need to see proof of authorization. Otherwise, this is trespassing. Janice turns red. She says, I am the compliance officer. I have the authority. He says, show me the authorization. She does not respond. He turns to the contractors. He says, you cannot proceed without proof of authorization. The contractors look at each other. One of them says, we were told this was approved. The officer says it is not. You need to leave. The contractors get in the truck and drive away. Janice glares at me. She says, this is not over. She gets in the golf cart and drives away. The blinking amber light is still on. The officer turns to me. He says, you need to get this resolved with the HOA. I cannot keep coming out here. I say, I am trying. They keep changing the rules. He says, if they try to remove your property again without authorization, call us. I thank him. He leaves. I go inside and email Mark. I say, your compliance officer just tried to have my property removed without board authorization. I have a police report documenting the incident. I need a written response confirming that no vendor will be hired without a board vote. I hit send. I do not expect a reply. That afternoon, I get a text from a number I do not recognize. It says, you need to stop causing trouble or you are going to regret it. I block the number. 10 minutes later, I get another text from a different number. It says the HOA has ways of making your life very difficult. I block that number too. I screenshot both texts and send them to Ed. He calls me. He says, that is harassment. You need to document everything. I say, I am. He says, Janice is panicking. She knows the vote was invalid and she knows you are not backing down. She is going to escalate. I say, how much worse can it get? He says she is going to try to get you on something else. She is going to look for any violation she can find and pile on the fines. I say, I have not violated anything. He says she will make something up. Watch your property. Watch your car. If she can get you towed, she will. I hang up and go outside. I check the fence panels. I check the wheelbarrow. I check the truck. Everything is still there. I move the truck to the street just in case. That night, I hear the golf cart again. I look out the window. Janice is driving slowly past my house. She stops and takes a photo of my truck. Then she drives away. I take a photo of the golf cart. The amber light is still blinking. I send the photo to Ed. He replies, she is building a case. I write back, for what? He replies, for anything. She is going to try to get you at the special session. I write back, when is the special session? He replies, next Tuesday, 7 p.m. I write back, that is 5 days away. He replies, use the time to get your evidence ready. I am going to send you the recording tonight. The recording arrives at midnight. It is a 40-minute audio file. I listen to the whole thing. Ed is right. There are only 3 board members present. Mark is there. Janice is there. One other person is there. They do not call roll. They do not establish a quorum. They vote on the visible storage rule. The vote is 3-0. No one objects. No one asks for public comment. The meeting ends. I save the file to 3 different places. I also download the HOA bylaws again and read the section on quorum. It says a quorum is 4 board members. If fewer than 4 are present, the meeting is not valid. I make a note. I also read the section on rule changes. It says any new rule must be posted for public comment for at least 30 days before a vote. The visible storage rule was posted for 3 days. I make another note. The next morning, I get an email from the management company. It says they are providing the requested public records. Attached is a PDF. I open it. The PDF contains the minutes from the special meeting. The minutes say 5 board members were present. The minutes say the vote was unanimous. The minutes say there was public comment and no objections were raised. I compare the minutes to the recording. They do not match. I forward the email to Ed. He calls me 5 minutes later. He says they falsified the minutes. I say, can we prove it? He says, we have the recording. I say, will they accept it? He says they have to. It is evidence. I say, what if they refuse? He says, then you file a complaint with the state and you sue them for fraud. I say, I do not have money for a lawyer. He says, you do not need a lawyer. You just need the recording and the bylaws. I say, what do I do at the special session? He says, you play the recording. You read the quorum rule. You demand that the visible storage rule be voided. You demand that the enforcement action be dropped. If they refuse, you walk out and file the complaint. I say, what if Janice tries to stop me? He says, she cannot. You have the floor. If she interrupts, you cite the open meeting rules. If Mark tries to shut you down, you cite the bylaws. If they try to vote without hearing you, you object on the record. I say, this is insane. He says, welcome to HOA politics. I spend the next 4 days preparing. I print the recording transcript. I print the minutes. I print the bylaws. I highlight every inconsistency. I also print the emails from the attorney and the management company. I put everything in a binder. I label the sections. I practice what I am going to say. I time myself. I have 5 minutes of material. I cut it down to 3. I do not want to give them an excuse to cut me off. On Tuesday, I drive to the clubhouse early. The parking lot is fuller this time. There are at least 20 cars. Ed is already there. He says word got out. People are curious. I say, that is good, right? He says, it depends. If the board feels pressured, they might fold. If they feel attacked, they might double down. I say, what do you think they will do? He says, I think Janice is going to try to control the narrative. You need to get ahead of her. I nod. We go inside. The meeting room is packed. There are at least 30 people in the audience. Janice is sitting in the front row. She has the binder on her lap. She is wearing the body camera. Mark is at the table with the other 4 board members. He looks nervous. He starts the meeting. He says, we are here to address the enforcement matter involving the property at my address. He looks at me. He says, you have requested an opportunity to respond. You have 3 minutes. I stand up. I walk to the front. I open the binder. I say, I am here to present evidence that the visible storage rule was not legally passed. I pull out the recording transcript. I say, this is a transcript of the special meeting where the rule was voted on. The transcript shows that only 3 board members were present. The bylaws require a quorum of 4. Without a quorum, the vote is invalid. Mark says, we had 5 members present. I say, the recording shows otherwise. Mark says, we do not accept recordings as evidence. I say, this is a public meeting. Recordings are allowed under Illinois law. Mark looks at the attorney. The attorney whispers something to him. Mark says, we will review the transcript and respond. I say, I am not done. I pull out the minutes. I say, the minutes you provided say 5 board members were present, and the vote was unanimous. The recording shows that is false. I also have evidence that the rule was posted for only 3 days instead of the required 30 days. Mark says, that is not relevant. I say, it is absolutely relevant. If the rule was not properly passed, the enforcement is invalid. You cannot fine me for violating a rule that does not exist. Janice stands up. She says the rule exists. It was passed legally. I say the recording proves otherwise. She says recordings can be edited. I say this recording has not been edited. It is a continuous file with a timestamp. She says, I do not care. You are in violation and you need to comply. I turn to Mark. I say, I am requesting that the board void the visible storage rule and drop the enforcement action. Mark says, we will take it under advisement. I say, I am also requesting that the board investigate the compliance officer for harassment. I have text messages threatening me. I have photos of the compliance officer surveilling my property at night. I have a police report documenting an unauthorized attempt to remove my property. Mark says those are separate matters. I say they are not separate. They are part of a pattern of abuse. I pull out the public records response. I say I also requested records of prior complaints filed by Janice Smith. You have not provided them. I am requesting them now. Mark says we will provide them when we are ready. I say you are legally required to provide them within 10 days. It has been 8 days. I need them before this meeting ends. Mark looks flustered. He says we do not have them here. I say then this meeting should be postponed until you do. Ed stands up. He says I have a copy of the recording if anyone wants to hear it. Mark says that is not necessary. Ed says I think it is. He pulls out his phone and presses play. The recording starts. You can hear Mark's voice. You can hear Janice's voice. You can hear the third board member. No one else speaks. The recording runs for 2 minutes. Ed stops it. He says that is enough. The room is silent. Mark looks at Janice. Janice looks at the floor. Mark says we need to consult with the attorney. He stands up. The board goes into a closed session. The audience starts talking. Ed leans over and says, "You got them." I say it is not over yet. He says, "It is close." The board comes back 15 minutes later. Mark looks pale. He says, after consulting with the attorney, the board has decided to rescind the visible storage rule pending further review. He says the enforcement action is dropped. He says I am free to proceed with the fence work. He does not look at me. He looks at Janice. She is still staring at the floor. I say I need that in writing. Mark says, you will receive a letter within 48 hours. I say I also need the prior complaint records. Mark says we will provide them. I sit down. The meeting ends. People start leaving. Ed shakes my hand. He says, you won. I say I am not celebrating yet. He says, you should. You just beat the HOA. I say I beat one rule. Janice is still the compliance officer. He says not for long. I look at him. He says 3 people just filed complaints about her tonight. The board is going to have to address it. I say, how do you know? He says, I talked to them. They were waiting for someone to stand up to her. You gave them the courage. I nod. I walk out. Janice is standing by the golf cart. She glares at me. She does not say anything. She gets in the cart and drives away. The amber light is still blinking. 2 days later, I get the letter from the HOA. It says the visible storage rule has been rescinded and the enforcement action is dropped. It says I am authorized to proceed with the fence work. It does not mention the survey. It does not mention the setback. I call the management company and ask for clarification. They say the original survey is acceptable and I do not need a new one. I ask if there are any other requirements. They say no. I hang up. I start building the fence. The fence crew arrives on a Thursday morning. There are 3 guys. They bring a truck full of tools and materials. Janice is waiting for them. She is standing in my driveway with the clipboard and the megaphone. She says the truck is blocking the street and they need to move. The crew foreman says they are parked legally. She says they are creating a safety hazard. He ignores her. She turns on the megaphone and starts yelling. She says the fence work is not authorized and the crew needs to leave immediately. The foreman looks at me. I show him the letter from the HOA. He nods. He tells the crew to start unloading. Janice keeps yelling. A neighbor comes out and tells her to be quiet. She turns the megaphone on the neighbor. The neighbor goes back inside. The crew starts digging post holes. Janice walks over and takes photos. She says they are digging in the wrong place. The foreman says they are following the survey. She says the survey is wrong. He ignores her. She calls the police. The police arrive. It is the same officer from before. He recognizes me. He says, what is going on now? I explain. He looks at Janice. He says, do you have evidence that the work is not authorized? She shows him the clipboard. He says, this is not evidence. This is your personal notes. She says, I am the compliance officer. He says, that does not give you the authority to stop lawful construction. She says the HOA has rules. He says the HOA is not law enforcement. If you keep harassing this crew, I am going to cite you for disorderly conduct. She gets in the golf cart and drives away. The crew finishes the first post hole. The crew works for 3 days. Janice shows up every day. She takes photos. She yells. She calls the police twice more. The police tell her to stop. On the 3rd day, she files a complaint with the city. A city inspector shows up. He looks at the fence. He looks at the survey. He looks at the permit. I did not know I needed a permit. He says I do. He says the city requires a permit for any fence over 4 feet. My fence is 6 feet. He says I need to stop work until I get the permit. I ask how long that takes. He says 2 weeks. I ask what happens if I do not stop. He says the city can issue a stop work order and fine me. I tell the crew to stop. They pack up. I go to City Hall and apply for the permit. The clerk says the application looks fine. She says the permit will be ready in 10 business days. I ask if there is any way to expedite it. She says no. I go home. I email the HOA and tell them the city inspector came and I need a permit. I ask if the HOA has any additional requirements for the permit. They do not reply. A week later, I get an email from the management company. It says the HOA has received a complaint from the city that my fence work is not permitted. It says the HOA is issuing a stop work order and I am prohibited from resuming construction until the permit is obtained. I email back and say I already stopped work and I am waiting for the permit. They do not reply. The next day I get a letter from the HOA attorney. It says the city has confirmed that the fence work is not in compliance with city code and the HOA is authorized to take enforcement action. It says I have 10 days to obtain the permit or the HOA will issue a fine of $500 per day. I call the city and ask if they told the HOA my work was not in compliance. The clerk says no. She says the inspector filed a report that the work was stopped pending permit approval. She says there is no violation. I ask if she can send me a copy of the report. She says yes. She emails it to me 5 minutes later. The report says the work is in compliance with city code and the only issue is the missing permit. I forward the report to the management company and the attorney. I say the city has confirmed there is no violation and the stop work order is invalid. I do not hear back. 2 days later, the permit is ready. I pick it up. I call the crew and ask them to come back. They say they can start next Monday. I say fine. I email the HOA and tell them the permit is approved and work will resume on Monday. I attach a copy of the permit. They do not reply. On Monday, the crew comes back. Janice is waiting. She has a new clipboard. She says the permit is not valid because it does not include the setback measurements. The foreman says the permit does not need to include setback measurements because the setback is on the survey. She says the survey is not valid. He says the city accepted the survey. She says the HOA has not accepted it. He says the HOA does not have the authority to override the city. She calls the police. The police do not come. She calls the city. The city does not come. She gets in the golf cart and drives away. The crew finishes the fence. The fence looks great. It is 6 feet tall, cedar panels, black posts. The crew cleans up and leaves. I take photos. I send them to Ed. He replies, "Looks good. How is Janice taking it?" I reply, "She has not come by yet." He replies, "She will." That night I hear the golf cart. I look out the window. Janice is driving slowly along the fence. She stops and gets out. She pulls out a tape measure. She measures the height of the fence. She writes something on the clipboard. She measures the distance from the fence to the property line. She writes something else. She takes photos. Then she gets back in the cart and drives away. I take a photo of her measuring. I send it to Ed. He replies, "She is looking for anything." I write back, "Let her look." The next morning, I get an email from the management company. It says the HOA has received a complaint that my fence exceeds the maximum allowable height. It says the maximum height is 5 feet and my fence is 6 feet. It says I need to reduce the height within 10 days or the HOA will issue a fine. I pull out the bylaws. The bylaws say the maximum fence height is 6 feet. I email the management company and attach the bylaw section. I say the fence is in compliance. They do not reply. I email the attorney. I say the same thing. He does not reply. I email Mark. I say the same thing. He replies, "The compliance officer has determined that the maximum height is 5 feet based on the neighborhood standards." I reply, "The bylaws say 6 feet." He replies, "The neighborhood standards supersede the bylaws." I reply, "Show me the neighborhood standards." He does not reply. I call Ed. I tell him what is happening. He says they are making it up. I say, "I know." He says you need to force them to prove it. I say, "How?" He says you go to the next board meeting and you demand to see the neighborhood standards in writing. If they cannot produce them, you demand that the complaint be dropped. I say, "What if they refuse?" He says, "You file a complaint with the state." I say, "I am tired of fighting." He says, "I know, but you are almost done. They are desperate. They know they lost. This is their last shot." I say, "Fine." "When is the next meeting?" He says, "Thursday." I say, "I will be there." Thursday night, I go to the clubhouse. The parking lot is packed again. Ed is already inside. He waves me over. He says, big crowd tonight. I say, why? He says, Janice is on the agenda. 3 homeowners filed formal complaints. The board has to address it. I say, what are the complaints? He says, harassment, abuse of authority, and falsifying records. I say, who filed them? He says, the 3 people I told you about, plus 1 more. I say, who is the 4th? He says, me. I stare at him. I say, you filed a complaint. He says, I have been documenting her behavior for 2 years. I have recordings, photos, emails. I submitted everything. The board has to act. I say, thank you. He says, do not thank me. Thank yourself. You gave people the courage to speak up. The meeting starts. Mark looks exhausted. He goes through the agenda. There is a discussion about pool rules. There is a discussion about landscaping bids. Then he says, we have a personnel matter to address. He looks at Janice. She is sitting in the front row. She is not wearing the body camera. Mark says the board has received multiple complaints regarding the compliance officer. We are going to address them in closed session. Janice stands up. She says, I have a right to defend myself. Mark says, you will have an opportunity to respond. Janice says, I want to respond now. Mark says, this is not the time. Janice says, you are trying to silence me. Mark says, we are following procedure. Janice says, I am the reason this neighborhood stays civilized. If you remove me, this place will fall apart. Mark says, no one is removing you. We are reviewing the complaints. Janice says, the complaints are lies. I have done everything by the book. Mark says, we will discuss it in closed session. Janice sits down. The board goes into closed session. The audience starts talking. Ed leans over and says, she is done. I say, you think so? He says, I know so. The board cannot ignore 4 complaints. If they do, the homeowners will vote them out. I nod. I wait. The board comes back 30 minutes later. Mark looks grim. He says after reviewing the complaints, the board has decided to suspend the compliance officer pending further investigation. He says the suspension is effective immediately. Janice stands up. She says, you cannot do this. Mark says, we just did. Janice says, I will sue. Mark says, that is your right. Janice grabs her clipboard and walks out. The room is silent. Mark says the board will appoint an interim compliance officer and will conduct a full review of all enforcement actions taken in the past 6 months. He says any homeowner who believes they were unfairly targeted can request a hearing. He looks at me. He says, that includes you. I nod. The meeting ends. People start clapping. Ed shakes my hand. He says, you did it. I say, we did it. He says, no, you started it. I just helped. I walk out. The parking lot is empty except for the golf cart. The amber light is off. A week later, I get a letter from the HOA. It says the Eagle Ridge Association retracts the fence violation in writing. It says the fence is in compliance with the bylaws and the city code. It says all enforcement actions are dropped and no fines will be assessed. It says the board apologizes for any inconvenience. I take a photo of the letter and send it to Ed. He replies, congratulations. I reply, thank you for everything. He replies, anytime. I also get an email from the management company. It says the public records request has been completed. Attached is a PDF. I open it. The PDF contains a list of complaints filed by Janice Smith over the past 2 years. There are 47 complaints. 32 of them were against the same 6 homeowners. 15 of them were dismissed by the board. The rest resulted in fines or enforcement actions. I scroll through the list. My name is on it 4 times. 3 of the complaints are about the fence. 1 is about the wheelbarrow. I save the file. I also noticed that 12 of the complaints were filed on days when the board did not have a quorum. I make a note. The next day I get a call from Mark. He says the board is conducting a full audit of the compliance program. He says they have hired an outside consultant to review all enforcement actions and recommend changes. He says he wants to personally apologize for the way I was treated. He says the board should have acted sooner. I say thank you. He says we are also reviewing the neighborhood standards. If there are any rules that are not clearly written, we are going to fix them. I say that is good to hear. He says, if you have any suggestions, please let us know. I say I will. He hangs up. I sit down. I look out the window. The fence is still standing. The wheelbarrow is still in the driveway. The truck is still on the street. Everything is quiet. 2 weeks later, I see a post in the neighborhood group chat. It says the HOA is looking for a new compliance officer. It says Janice Smith has resigned. The post is signed by Mark. Below the post is a comment from Janice. It says, I was forced out by a group of homeowners who do not care about property values. The comment is up for 10 minutes. Then it is deleted. A new comment appears. It says the previous comment violated the group chat rules and has been removed. The board regrets any confusion. Signed, Mark. I screenshot the exchange. I send it to Ed. He replies, karma. I reply, agreed. A month later, I am sitting on my porch drinking coffee when a car pulls up. A woman gets out. She is holding a clipboard. I tense up. She walks over and says, hi, I am the new compliance officer. My name is Linda. I am here to introduce myself. I say, okay. She says, I wanted to let you know that the board is committed to fair and transparent enforcement. If you ever have a question about the rules, please reach out. I say thank you. She says, I also wanted to say that your fence looks great. I say thanks. She says, have a good day. She gets back in her car and drives away. I sit back down. I take a sip of coffee. The fence is still standing. The neighborhood is quiet. For the first time in 2 months, I feel like I can breathe. A few weeks after that, I am at the hardware store picking up some gate hardware when I run into one of the homeowners who filed a complaint against Janice. His name is Tom. He says, hey, I wanted to thank you. I say, for what? He says, for standing up to Janice. She was harassing me for months over a mailbox placement. After you fought back, I found the courage to file my complaint. The board sided with me. I got a full refund on the fines. I say, that is great. He says, a lot of people are grateful. You changed the culture here. I say, I just wanted to build a fence. He laughs. He says, well, you did more than that. He shakes my hand and walks away. I pay for the hardware and drive home. That night I install the gate. It swings open smoothly. I lock it. I unlock it. I lock it again. It works perfectly. I step back and look at the whole fence. It is solid. It is level. It is exactly what I wanted. I think about the past 2 months, the emails, the threats, the meetings, the police calls, the recordings, the complaints, the fights. It was exhausting. It was stressful. It was worth it. I go inside. I check my email. There is a message from the management company. It says the board has voted to amend the bylaws to include clearer definitions of violations and a formal appeals process. It says the amendments will be posted for public comment for 60 days before a vote. I close the email. I look out the window. The fence is still standing. The gate is locked. The neighborhood is quiet. I won. A few months later, I am driving my route when I get a notification on my phone. It is from the neighborhood group chat. I check it at the next stop. The post says the board has voted to dissolve the compliance officer position entirely. It says enforcement will now be handled by a committee of 3 homeowners elected annually. It says the committee will follow a written process and all decisions will be subject to appeal. The post is signed by Mark. There are 50 comments below it. Most of them are positive. One of them is from Ed. It says, this is what accountability looks like. I like the comment. I finish my route. I drive home. The fence is still standing. The gate is still locked. The neighborhood is still quiet. Everything is exactly the way it should be. A week after that, I am mowing the lawn when a neighbor walks over. She is in her 60s, wearing a sun hat. She says, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Carol. I just moved in across the street. I say, nice to meet you. She says, I heard about what happened with the HOA. She says, I wanted to say thank you. I moved here because I thought it was a nice, quiet neighborhood, but after I heard the stories, I almost backed out. Then I heard you stood up to them and won. I decided to stay. I say, I am glad. She says, Me too. She walks back to her house. I finish mowing. I go inside. I look out the window. The fence is still standing. The gate is still locked. The neighborhood is still quiet. For the first time since I moved here, it feels like home. That night, I get an email from the city. It says a city inspector confirming what the Ho cannot enforce sent a follow-up report stating that my fence is fully compliant with all local ordinances. The email says the inspector noted that the HOA attempted to impose additional restrictions that are not supported by city code. The email says the city has flagged the HOA for review. I forward the email to Ed. He replies, "Perfect." I write back, "What does that mean?" He replies, "It means if the HOA tries this again with anyone else, the city is watching." I smile. I close my laptop. I go outside and sit on the porch. The fence is still standing. The gate is still locked. The neighborhood is still quiet. I won. The final piece falls into place a month later when I check the neighborhood group chat and see that Karen's group post gets removed and replaced with a correction. The correction says the previous post contained false information about the compliance process and has been removed in accordance with the group chat rules. The correction is signed by Mark. Below it is a comment from Linda, the new compliance officer. It says if anyone has questions about the enforcement process, please feel free to contact me directly. I will be happy to walk you through the new procedures. I screenshot the post. I send it to Ed. He replies full circle. I reply, "Yeah." He replies, "You should be proud." I reply, "I am." I close the app. I look out the window. The fence is still standing. The gate is still locked. The neighborhood is still quiet. Everything is exactly the way it should be. I did it. I won. And I did it the right way. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.